So welcome to section C of the study skills tutorial for Free University Brighton. This section covers 3 general topics, each of which has various dimensions. So first of all, we start thinking about how we think about our studying around a particular topic, how we develop those ideas, how we start to think about developing our writing style. Then we move on to looking at how we read, how we take notes, how we do those things efficiently. Then we look at what critical thinking is and how to develop that. And all of that, of course, feeds into how we structure and prepare for writing an essay or other project. So first of all, how do we actually develop ideas? How do we focus our work in terms of the kind of preparation that you need for an essay or something like that? So initially, there are the W's and the H's, the what, where, when, how, and who. So from your initial reading or listening to lectures or your ideas already, you'll think about an issue or topic. What's the nature of that topic? Why is it important? Where does it happen? Is it a country? Is it an area? Is it a group of institutions? When did it happen? Is there a time frame? Is it pre-1960s? Is it recently? Where does this issue or topic refer to? What time period? How is the issue relevant? What are the key questions that need to be answered about this particular issue? What are your research questions? And finally, who would be involved in it? Which institutions? Which groups of people? And also, which key academic texts? So apply those thoughts to your own ideas and start to refine and specify what you're interested in. Then the use of drawings and lists is very important. One thing you can do, you can just brainstorm your own ideas, and then you can write those down and store them somewhere, and then even start to reorganize that into how it relates to constructing an argument. So you go from disorder to order. So you take your fairly disordered thoughts and start to try and put them into some kind of logical order or logical argument. So you can cut those bits of paper up, you can stick them on the wall, you can put them on a table and move them around. Anything which stimulates your thinking to try and find some kind of connection between the different points, the different issues. And then, of course, one way of doing that is to draw diagrams. There are various ways of doing that, and there'll be more of that later on. But 2 particular techniques are drawing rich pictures or drawing mind maps. Another thing that's really good to help you get started on writing is to allow yourself to make connections with real live debates. So basically look at YouTube, listen to radio programs, track down debates related to the subject that you're interested in, and that will really help you focus. Because in there, the reporters and the other people speaking will highlight the key issues. Of course, you want to go from general to specific in general terms. So that means you search for papers or chapters that summarize the issues for you. So you can start from a general understanding and then refine that. So, for example, a review article is a very useful start. So these are ways of developing your ideas. But basically, once you've refined what you're interested in and you have a clear set of what, where, how, who, and when, you will then have a better idea of what your keywords are for your searching. So getting started on writing is really about trying to put more complex ideas into a more linear or structured format, say for an essay or a podcast or even a presentation. And the basic approach to these is much the same. Of course, we all have different styles and techniques to doing this, preparing for writing, but there are some that are particularly useful. So, for example, some people find it very helpful to write a learning journal. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, think about your subject, your set of issues, and have thoughts about that and jot them down. Jot them down when you're reading. So in addition to the notes that you make on the reading, have another journal which records your thoughts about that. It can be a haphazard way, but it's just a way of helping your thinking. Sometimes we have our best thoughts when we're doing other things. Also take notes if you hear things on the radio or the television that's also very relevant. Don't lose vital thinking or information. So before beginning to write, it's good to go through all your notes and start to organise them or extract bits of them to get them clear in your head. And this is where you do lots of cutting and pasting. You can either do this on bits of paper or you can do it on the internet, as in using reference software, or you can use Office Suite to help you. But basically go through your notes and try and connect the notes to the issues and the subject that you're wanting to write about. Try and think about the relationship between what you've read and the questions you want to answer. Then practice writing about those connections. So just try and summarize your notes, summarize your thoughts, start to try and explain it in writing. Don't worry too much if it doesn't make sense or you discard it later. You need to practice developing your writing style. So really, this is probably quite a difficult stage in developing your ideas and getting ready to write, but it's an important one. It's a combination of both allowing yourself free thought and beginning to specify what you're really interested in. Always go back to the essay question and work out how it's linked to what you're thinking about. So a little bit more now about taking notes, because this is quite important to the whole studying process. One of the things about taking notes is that as you're reading, you're recording key concepts, key lines of argument, your thoughts about that, key literature, so you're extracting references from what you're reading, key theories, which may be named. There may be specific names for theories. You're also extracting chunks of text that you know illustrate or summarize even what you've just read. So, for example, a journal article will often be broken into sections. So those sections can become sections in your own notes. And then you can just write one paragraph for each of those sections, which you can more or less extract from the text. And that makes it much quicker to take notes. So there are various dimensions of notes. And one of the things that you need to do when you're taking notes is to highlight things that you don't quite understand. So if there's a word you don't understand or a phrase, then write that down and put a red mark next to it so that you know when you go back, you can actually check what that means. And by the time you go back, you may well understand it because you've been doing a bit more reading. And of course, you'll be taking notes in lectures as well, which is another thing where you will want to identify key texts that the lecturer mentions and make sure that you know what they are so that you can find those and read them.
So there are several tools that involve drawing that we can use to enhance our studying. And the first of these is mind maps. So what's the purpose of these and what uses are they put to? So these are creative tools to represent thoughts, information and ideas, but also, as you will see later, beyond that, specific concepts, for instance. They represent these dimensions clearly, but in a fairly linear format because it's drawn on paper or some flat linear surface, if you like. So they focus on distinct sections or topics of a project and then the subsequent subsections. It's a method of recording ideas as they emerge or as they are finalised. They can be used to stimulate debate in groups or provide debate for an individual within their own brain sphere, as it were. And they're a simple technique and powerful tool that provides a structure for further study and investigation. So how do we actually create and then use a mind map? So the first step is to find some central keywords or phrases which represent to you the important things in your work or your project or your plan or your studying. So these can be concepts, ideas, or issues, or thoughts, or dimensions. But the key thing is to have simple words or phrases and to find a central phrase. Actually, that could be a question. It could be a research question. So this can be used to identify sub-questions and research questions if you want to give it that orientation, but it doesn't have to have that. So step 2 is to find subtopics related to this and then to add those to the diagram and show the connections but in a hierarchy or order. So the first phrase or keyword can have multiple subtopics, and each of those can have multiple subtopics. So you connect the topics to each other in a spider web from the center with the subtopics allocated logically. Then the next step is really to review and revise this, especially after you've done a bit more reading, and use that revision process and review process to consider what further investigation you need to make. Are there any other areas you need to read about, or further subtopics that you need to identify? So during this process, you need to make notes on your thinking throughout the process so that you can use this tool in an interactive and creative way. So here you can see a mind map that basically covers everything in the 3 sections that you've already covered in your course. So that's the first one, which is learning processes and styles. The second section about technology information, and the third one, which is about resources information and literature reviews. So here you can see that each of the constituent topics or issues have been identified on this map so that you can easily run through it and find elements of the overall structure, but also the detail. You can quickly home down and find out that time management is part of the course, and that covers study methods and techniques, personal reflection, development, and project planning. So this is how beneficial mind maps are to identify the key elements of something, usually information, possibly studying, or it can be applied to any situation actually. So it's a useful way of summarizing, structuring, and identifying elements of a system, if you like, or a thing that you're doing. So has various different uses that you may be able to see from this example. So now we're going to introduce you to a second approach to drawing in a way that can enhance our thinking and our studying. And this is called rich pictures. And that term is associated with something called soft systems methodology, which was developed by a man called Peter Checkland and a team of people who were actually software engineers, but seeking a way of modeling systems that allowed people to solve problems. So what is soft systems methodology and how would we use it? So it's a set of techniques that model world views, and the plural of views there is on purpose because it can model several different views at the same time. It describes the problems that you find or can see in complex real world situations. So it's very embedded in what's going on. And it allows you to identify the divergent issues and dynamics within that system. So within that, you can represent organizations, information, factors, processes, change, or transitions, and you can explore the nature of the problem and its context so that that is fully understood in order to develop solutions effectively. Although in this situation, we're not expecting you to understand the whole of the approach. We're going to use a very simplified version. So we're going to go into this in a bit more detail and start to think about how it might directly relate to your studying process. So, rich pictures, they're a creative approach to representing a situation in order to explain or explore it. And in doing this picture, you start to set boundaries, define interests. So the process of drawing makes you think and helps you think. So that's one of the benefits of doing this. So the rich pictures represent process and other elements in a defined environment. So you have to define your environments that you're interested in. There can be various types of environments, and there can be multiple environments as well. So basically, this is where you start to define where the boundaries are around what you're doing. So this is very helpful if you're not sure how far your project spreads What does it apply to? An environment could be a group of organisations and a process that links them. It could be a place. It could be a country. It could be a type of manufacturing. It could be, if you think about studying, it could be the environment, could be a policy system. It could be a social interaction. It could be young people in a particular place in London that suffer crime. So that could be your environment. So you need to use this process to sort of expand your imagination, but also clarify what you're actually interested in and what's important within that. So also rich pictures allow you to record and represent information flow, institutions, factors and influences on the environments and within the environments that you outline, people and places, etc. But what you're really doing is developing and representing an interactive and dynamic system, which of course is subject to change or development. And this system that you're representing can be multi-dimensional, it can be contested, and within it you can represent information and the power dynamics and relationships as well. So it's a very flexible tool. So you can show the fluid dynamics and processes, the actors and elements, the players and the perspectives that you think are important. And this is particularly useful if you want to write an essay or define a project and draw boundaries around it. So it's more orientated to that, but not just. It could be that you want to draw rich pictures all the way through your learning to represent the kind of things that you're learning as you learn them, as a way of remembering them and recording them. So this is a tool which can be used in various different ways, because some people really benefit from visual representations of things and it helps them remember. So this is also a tool for recording things in a way that enhance your memory. So you could literally read an article or a paper or a book or a chapter, and then you could represent that in rich pictures. Or you could draw pictures before and during writing a piece, which is answering a research question. So the rich pictures could be orientated towards your research question. So you can see it's a very, very flexible tool. So here you've got a rich picture which basically represents what's happening within this course. So you've got the exterior learning environment and context within which you've got various elements like academic networks, governments, political, activist, policy. These are all elements of the environment that can interact to enable connection that can then feed into the learner's experience. So you've got the learner inside the immediate learning environment, interacting with the course, with other students, utilizing the knowledge of tutors, practicing and utilizing techniques, using libraries. The inputs come from the libraries, whether those are virtual or physical. You've also got things like the World Wide Web and digital virtual groups. And then you've got the outcomes, which are the learning outcomes for the course, which are represented on this map and picture. So you can see this is, again, a very quick way of representing what's happening within a dynamic system. It's different from a mind map because it's not as static. There can be movement and interaction within this representation that you perhaps wouldn't get in a mind map. And also you can use pictures and diagrams and sort of flow diagram techniques here to represent things that mean things to people. So for example, I could have had a picture of a government building or a picture of a university, or I could have put something to represent activism, for example, or maybe something that better represented the way debates, ideas and discussions happen. So you can see that it's a very creative, even more creative way of explaining something. And because it's a rich picture, it tends to look at different environments, what's happening within the environment, how it interacts with other environments or the external environment. And that's a really useful way of representing something that is basically some kind of a system, even if it's very dynamic and changing. So I hope you can see the uses of rich picture techniques and how useful they would be to maybe communicate with somebody. So this is what I'm studying. This summarizes the system I'm learning about. This is a representation of my thoughts about a system. So that's how it would be used. So moving on to think about writing and how best to do it, it's probably true to say that good writing also depends on the purpose and the context in which it's being done, as much as the style and the structure and the content, etc. So different types of writing exist for different reasons in different mediums, and all of this affects how you write. So the internet, a book, a newspaper article, they're all different styles, content, and they're all directed at different audiences. So this affects the style of writing, the type of information that's used, and the way that the arguments are presented, obviously. And this is also true for academic writing, which can be very verbose or convoluted and complex. Of course, those are big words in themselves, and it doesn't always have to be so. I think this is a very important point. It is okay to go beyond what is normal or standard and make things clearer. But what we need to think about are the ideas that lie behind the writing, how you get clear in your own mind about those as part and parcel of the process of writing. Because when you've got clarity in your head and a structure, writing is so much easier, and you can so much more easily meet the needs of the audience. So it's useful to basically explore differences in styles of writing. So read various different types of materials and notice how different the styles are. Notice how they include certain things and don't include others, what language they use, what is their evidence, how do they present ideas. Now, you can, of course, mimic styles, but really, if you're going to be writing critically, you are going to have to go beyond what's normal and what's standard. And you are also going to have to find your own words, find your own style. So that's very important too. And that does take time and concentration. So here's a simple diagram which expresses really how to structure writing. So basically, in the middle, you've got the main point of writing, which could be an essay question, or it could be a topic, or it could be a theme. Now, if you look at this diagram, you'll see it's very similar to a mind map. And that's how you get from a mind map to an essay structure, although they're not always the same thing. Because remember, when we were talking about mind maps, we said they could be used for all sorts of interactive things. So you could read a bit, do a mind map, then read something else. So mind maps that are for recording what you've learnt might be slightly different from those that you use to structure an essay, because it's a flexible tool. But notice that this looks very much like a mind map. So going back to this particular way of expressing it in diagrammatic form, if you like, you've got as many points on this as is relevant, and each point that you pull out of the main topic or question are subsections, if you like, which could be sections of the essay or the piece of writing. And then you could divide that up into further subsections or points, and you can make this as large as you wish. And it's really only a way of thinking about, well, what are the key elements of this topic and what are the constituents of that? What else can I think about in more and more detail until you've actually captured phrases or words that remind you what to include and give you some kind of structure to do that in? Because then each of your arms of this spider's web, if you like, can either be a chapter or a paragraph or a page. So it's a really good way of approaching writing. It's effectively a way of planning it out. So this focuses really on what are the key points that you want to make and what are the key arguments that you might want to identify in this structure. So these sorts of diagrams are done after reading and before planning a piece of writing, as well, as we've said before. And one thing that you'll need to do now to go from this kind of planning to actually sitting down and writing is to do some practicing. So basically, you can pick out a section of your diagram and say, right, okay, I'm going to practice writing up this part. And writing up that part will be about summarizing the information that you've got in your notes, in your recordings and so on, that relate to that part of the structure. So practice writing. And you may also practice summarizing that after you've done it. So basically, it's a process, and it's a set of developments, if you like, in your writing style that you put in place. It doesn't happen straight away. You really need to work at this. So now we're going to talk about writing. Most of what we'll say will be relevant to essays, but also other types of writing, because all writing has a basic structure, and that structure has the same basic elements. Even a newspaper article will have a certain logical flow and structure. But for the purposes of being complete, we're going to focus this mainly on essay writing. So the structure that you need to aim for is basically an introduction, which is usually short and outlines the topic and the issues and the approach you're taking. The middle, which is where you explain what your findings are and what you believe and why you believe it and how you believed it, what information did you include, what you didn't include. And then finally a conclusion, which is, what do you make of all of this? What's the knowledge that you would like to put out to the world as a result of your writing and your research and your investigation? So that's basically a summary of what's happened previously, just regurgitating the main findings, but also perhaps extrapolating a bit and saying why it's relevant to the key problems that you're trying to address or the research questions. Sometimes you have to go back and rewrite the introduction after you've done the conclusion, because you can see things differently by the time you get to the end. So this is a dynamic structure, really, in a way. And it's good to hold on to that basic vision of what writing is about before going into some of the detail about what's contained in each of these sections. So now we're going to go into each of these sections in great detail and explain how it would be approached and what you would include. So here we have an introduction to the basic structure of a review, and it's important to understand that before understanding the detail. So the first section of a review is, of course, the introduction. And the second section, or sections, is the main body, which can include various subtopics or sections, etc. And finally, you want your conclusions and your final summary. So now we'll look into what each of these different parts of the literature review contain. So here we have a pictorial representation of that. So you've got the purpose of the review, which can be boiled down into 4 different dimensions. So the first is the purpose of the review is related to the research questions, the validity of the claims that you make in the whole piece of work. It's an overview of the critical analysis of the main literature, and it's an introduction to the problem and its context. So to move on to the main body of the review, which of course can be broken down into different sections and so on, what does this actually include and how is it orientated? Well, firstly, it's the place where you present and provide initial discussion of the overall findings from your review. It describes the kind of literature that you've utilised, how you found it, and why you chose those methods and approaches. And it also enables you to begin to discuss your review of that literature, your understanding of it, your interpretation of it, your critical analysis of it, and the gaps in knowledge that you've identified as you go along. So, for example, you can comment as well, for instance, on the relevance and usefulness of the sources of information, and you can address that to certain debates, certain research questions. You can draw on different academic traditions and disciplines, and so on and so forth. But really what you're aiming for is an integrated presentation of your thinking. So to go over that again and make it clear, this is a diagram of the literature that's central to the topic you're investigating in your review. It can be broken down into 4 dimensions or elements. So the first one, it provides detailed overviews of your findings. It explains your methods of searching for literature and information and the criteria that you used, commenting on gaps in information or knowledge. It presents the sources of information that you've utilised, and it describes the kind of literature that you've found. So what else do we need to know about this very important section, which is quite large usually in the dissertation or in the review? What does this section cover and how is it orientated? So firstly, it's the literature that's central to the topic that you're addressing, and it has to provide an overview and a summary of that, but also in many respects you're also weaving that together with your own comments on that literature. It's not just they said this, she said that, he said the other. It's why and how those findings from research that you've found in the literature have arisen, and developing your own critical perspective or a critical review of the ways in which the research that you're looking at has been done provides you with critical analysis. Effectively, that's what it is. So you're basically evaluating the information, and you're doing that by looking at the ways in which things have been constructed, developed, the arguments that have been produced, the conclusions that have been drawn to. Are they strong? Are they weak? Is it logical? Are there inconsistencies or contradictions within single pieces of literature or research or bodies of literature and research? And what are those strengths and weaknesses inherent in the different sets of information and knowledge that you're looking at? But the final objective of this writing up process is to summarize and evaluate that evidence and present it to somebody in a way that explains not only what's there, but what you're thinking about that. So to go over that again, the literature that you're reviewing is central to the main body of your work, and it has 4 specific dimensions. The first is to summarize and evaluate evidence on a topic, to evaluate the way in which information and knowledge has been produced, to critically review, for instance, the methodologies for the research that you're drawing on, and to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses in the literature. So now we turn to the conclusion section of the review, and in many respects it's easier to explain that because conclusion means what you've decided at the end of a process, really. And in the body of the review you're explaining the detail, but here you want to summarize that. So actually it's not new information very often, it's just key points from the rest of the work that you've done. So it's a concise summary, and it can reflect on the knowledge and draw out some final comments and thoughts that perhaps arise through the process of writing the main body that you want to clarify in your conclusion. And it can also comment on future research and identify more clarity about gaps in knowledge and why they've developed and where they lie for the topic that you're addressing. And it can also sometimes develop themes to provide a conceptual framework for a critique, and that's a very sociological way of expressing it. But basically there may be themes that arise in your analysis that you may want to emphasize in the conclusion by connecting it back to the original problem, the context in which that takes place, and the kinds of issues you're addressing. For instance, you may want to comment on what the themes are around the solution to those particular problems, whether they be political or policy or sociological or human or process or structural or organisational or whatever. So here's where you say what you really feel about the whole questions that you've posed at the beginning, really, and effectively you're answering them, but you're saying, well, maybe this part I can't address because it's still not clear what's happening here or why. So you draw out those kinds of findings in the conclusion. And of course, you really want to make that able to absorb very easily and quickly if you're a reader. So you might, for instance, want to actually list some of your key findings at the end, if that's appropriate. So to go over that again, here's a diagram of the elements of the final conclusion in your written literature review. So basically it's a concise summary which develops themes and may provide a conceptual framework, provides conclusions and key findings in an overview, identifies gaps in knowledge, and also describes current knowledge and your reflection on that, but in a very summarised form. So to just go over that again, these are the 4 main elements for the final conclusion section of your review. So overall, it's a concise summary which may develop themes within a conceptual framework, which draws out key findings and conclusions in an overview, which describes current knowledge and some reflection on that, and at the same time can identify gaps in knowledge. But the key thing here is that it's an overview of what you've already said, plus a few extra reflections and extra contextualization of your thoughts about this literature.